published a national security strategy for Israel, and Chuck is both a former deputy and national security advisor in Israel and at the Belfer Center in Harvard. So it gets the perfect defense intellectual with the experience both here and in Israel. So please take it.
Thank you, Paul, for hosting this and for the introduction, and thank you for coming. I think the quality makes up for the numbers. I had planned on making about a 30-minute presentation, but given the small group, I won't do that. Maybe I'll just say a few words to get the conversation going, and then we can do it all as pretty much all as Q&A. One thing that I will keep from the opening remarks is the opening joke, because it's a good joke. It's about one of the previous rounds of elections in Israel a few years ago. After the elections, during the transition, the new prime minister hasn't quite come into office yet. The old guy's still there. And the story is that some guy comes up to the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem and knocks on the front door, and the prime minister's wife answers, and he says, "Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please." And she said, "Well, you know, we're in the transition. He's not really prime minister anymore. And in any event, he's not home." The guy says, "Thank you very much," walks away. 15 minutes later, the same guy comes, knocks on the door. "Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please." So I told you before, he's not really prime minister anymore. And in any event, he's not home. Okay, thank you very much. 15 minutes later, comes, knocks on the door. "Hi, I'd like to tell me, what are you, stupid? Wait, don't you dense? Don't you get it? He's not the prime minister anymore." He says, "I understand. It's just so good to hear it." No names. Everybody can fill in according to
their comment on
you fill in according to your preferences. And I imagine that there might be some people in the room who would like to localize that joke as this white building down the road. So I think it's quite remarkable for a country that has had its fair share of national security issues that actually no one has ever written a public proposal for an Israeli national security strategy until this book, which was the reason I wrote the book, the last chapter. And I think I could say, maybe more importantly, some of the critics who've already read the book have said it's the most comprehensive book about Israeli national security written, certainly in recent decades. I think actually probably since Israel was established, but certainly in recent decades. And I think it's part of the importance of it is to encourage, to the extent possible, fact-based public discourse. Fake news, absence of fact-based public discourse did not start in the United States, to my way of thinking. And I think Israel has a grave need for this. Israel faces some critical issues. And for what it's worth, I wanted to make my contribution to that public debate. I hope it's a book that's valuable to policymakers, it's valuable to the defense establishment, but of course, as a contribution to the public debate, it'll be out in Hebrew hopefully next month. Inshallah. No guarantees. It'll be out, if not next month, the month after.
Who's the publisher?
Chot, which is the Defense Ministry's publishing house, but in conjunction with Modan, which is the big commercial, one of the two big commercial publishers. So let me make just mention a few of the primary points. First of all, I think, so this is Israel's 70th year. I think Israeli national security strategy has actually been a phenomenal success. Start with the fact that Israel exists, which was not a foregone conclusion in the early decades.
It hasn't been a foregone conclusion in many years since.
Well, I think there I might disagree with him. And
get to choose the year, but that's all right.
Okay. In recent decades, I think it has been. And I think actually we're at a point today where Israel is an established, prosperous, and fundamentally secure state. Now, when I say fundamentally secure, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of big problems out there. There are major threats. But I think Israel one, its existence. I think that there are no existential threats today, haven't been for decades, since Egypt made peace. And unless Iran goes nuclear, there won't be existential threats. And I believe that Israel can handle, we have to do everything possible to prevent Iran from going nuclear, but if it happens, it's also not the, we can handle that too, through deterrence. The Iranians are extremists, they're not crazy. But to say in Israel's context that there are no existential threats is a huge achievement. In any other country in the world, they say, well, big deal. Of course there are no existential threats. In Israel's case, after the first decades, I think that's a huge achievement. And to maintain a vibrant democracy, a problematic one, a vibrant democracy for 70 years in very difficult circumstances, a mid-European standard of living, I think Israel can say it's done very well for the first 70 years. And that's not all the good news.
We're going to pass it around.
The Arab states, the biggest threat that the Arab states pose today is not their strength, it's their weakness. It's they've come apart or are coming apart, in danger of coming apart once again. Israel is surrounded today, this is actually a problem, but it's surrounded by failed states. The Arab countries no longer wish or have the capability, in some cases both, of making war against Israel. So Egypt and Jordan have been at peace for decades. Syria and Iraq, the two primary military threats of recent decades, their militaries have been devastated by their internal convulsions, and in the Iraqi case also by the American intervention, but since then the internal convulsions. Except for Iran, which is a big exception, but there are no state-based threats of significance to Israel today. The threat is Iran and two non-state actors, primarily Hezbollah and secondarily Hamas. The Sunni states, with a couple of exceptions, or maybe I should say, the Gulf states now, are busy establishing, we were talking about this before, a growing relationship with Israel. A lot of it is still under the table, but it's there and it's expanding all the time. And we've seen absolutely dramatic developments in the last few years, including last year, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the holy places, saying that he recognizes Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East. This was almost a Sadat-like moment, which didn't get sufficient attention. And people are speculating about how far the actual cooperation can really go. Well, 3 years ago, we couldn't even imagine this. Israel has relations today with more countries than ever before in its history. In many cases, strong military relations, not just economic or diplomatic. There's no hostile superpower anymore. Russia's a friendly country. It's a problematic country for Israel, but it's a friendly country. And of course, Israel has a remarkable relationship with the United States, which I think we're doing everything we can to, pardon my academic expression, but we're working on it very diligently, but it's still there for the meantime. And so there are many good things. If you look at Israel's overall strategic picture today, I would say much better than it ever was. I think Israel has never been stronger, never more secure than it is today. So that's to start out with something positive, which is very unusual, almost unprecedented in the history of Israeli national security discourse. So now let me balance it by presenting the difficulties, because there are significant ones. And it's, first of all, it's Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. In that order, we say Iran and Hezbollah, it's almost, not quite, it's almost saying the same thing. Iran is, I believe, the most sophisticated adversary Israel has ever faced. It's also very big and far away. And if you take those three things together, I think Iran may be the first adversary Israel's ever faced that it can't defeat. It can defend itself against Iran. It can handle the situation. I sleep very well at night. But too big, too far, too sophisticated to be beaten. And what they have understood, the Arab states did not understand this in the early decades. They can't defeat Israel in 1 round or 2 rounds, maybe 3 rounds. what they've concluded is that it's a long-term, decades-long effort. They say in their public statements in the last year or two, 25 years, but the 25 can be 50 also, that's fine, they don't care. They have God on their side, it's a theocratic regime, so it'll be 50 years.
So it's not clear to me whether Israel is higher on their enemies list than the Sunnis.
Maybe not in the immediate order of priority, but in the ultimate order of priority. They don't want to destroy Saudi Arabia. Okay? They would like to make Saudi Arabia Shia, maybe. They'd at least like to win the competition for influence. They don't want to destroy Saudi Arabia. I think when they talk about destroying Israel, they're absolutely sincere. And since they can't do it in 1 or 2 or 3 rounds, because Israel, they recognize Israel today has overwhelming conventional military superiority. So there's a dual track approach. One is the long-term, what I call a strategy of attrition until destruction. Repeated low-level or limited conflicts in which Israel wastes its strength, uses it up. The economic cost of these conflicts is very high. It hits Israel's international standing very hard. And they're hoping that the ongoing pressure against the home front will lead to the collapse of Israeli society from within. Everything that Iran/Hezbollah and Hamas have been doing for the last, it's going on 40 years now, since the 80s, has been focused on one thing. They correctly identified Israel's home front as its weak point. The battle today isn't on the battlefield. It's on the home front, at least on the Israeli side. And so they've developed this truly staggering rocket capability in Lebanon. 130,000 rockets is the working figure. No one knows exactly. You know, maybe, would you two gentlemen maybe move over and then I can see everybody? I don't have to turn back and forth.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm not sorry. I mean, if it was a bigger crowd, then of course I would do it. This way I can just look in one direction and it'll do that. Thank you. So they've built up this staggering capability. There is no military in the world that has 130,000 rockets. Hamas has got a lousy 12,000. I once thought that was a big figure. Because in 2006, when the war broke out, Hezbollah was thought to have had something like that number at the time. I thought it was huge. Well, today it pales in comparison. It's also not quite as sophisticated an arsenal as the Hezbollah one, but the truth is it's also quite sizable. And all of this is directed at the civilian rear and the military rear. And in the case of Hezbollah, the Hamas arsenal isn't big enough, but in the case of Hezbollah, it may be the first Arab force in the history of the conflict with the capability to do 2 things: to disrupt IDF mobilization in emergency, because they'll be able to hit mobilization centers, warehouses, various other installations that are necessary for mobilization. They'll also be able to, well, 3 things. They'll also be able to disrupt offensive capabilities. First and foremost, operations of air bases, which is critical. But all of the offensive capability, they'll be able to hit hard with the rockets. And the third thing is that they can hit command and control. And when I say command and control, it's not just a military command and control center. It's the Prime Minister's office, it's the Defense Ministry, it's the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. No Arab country ever had this capability. And unfortunately, this is because Iran is such a carefully thinking adversary. They studied all of the previous rounds. They studied the changes in the nature of warfare. Warfare has undergone, not just in our context, in the world, has undergone a major change in recent decades. And they came up with this, people call it a hybrid solution. Hezbollah is a hybrid organization. It's not just a terrorist organization. It's not just a guerrilla organization. It's not just a socioeconomic force in Lebanon, the biggest in the country. It's also actually pretty much the national leadership. So that's one track, and the other track is the nuclear one. And they were forced to postpone the capability. They agreed to the deal in 2015. I don't think Iran for 1 minute gave up the long-term aspiration to achieve a nuclear capability. That was, and I believe remains, the objective. but because they take a long-term approach towards things. All right, the pain in 2015 was too heavy, the international price. We put it off for 10, 15 years. Again, we've got God on our side. We can win. And here, well, I think they're actually fit to be tied at the moment, because on the one hand, the United States proved what the hardliners in Iran always said. The U.S. can't be trusted. The U.S. doesn't obey, it doesn't adhere to its obligations. From their point of view, they're right, because this is an agreement that even American intelligence says they're adhering to so far. And the U.S. withdraws. And I don't see an American strategy behind it. Because I could understand taking a hard line, coming down on Iran approach. But just withdrawing from the agreement isn't a strategy, and then withdrawing from Syria certainly isn't a strategy. And yeah, there's this idea, this novel idea of setting up an Arab NATO, which every American administration has been trying to do for the last 40 years. So I don't think there's a strategy, an American strategy vis-a-vis Iran. I don't think there's a Mideast strategy. And I started saying they're feeling fit to be tied, but at the same time, they find themselves caught in the agreement because the Europeans and Russia and China are saying to them, don't dare withdraw. And the Europeans are saying, we're trying to do everything we can to keep this agreement alive. We even developed this mechanism, this new, what do they call it, the Instex. I forget what it stands for. It's a financial mechanism to get around the American sanctions. So you've got to stay in the agreement. And for the moment, the Iranians are still there. But that can change, and I think will change. It could change any moment. I think it will change at some point, because they've got their own domestic politics also. The moderates look a little bit, Rouhani, Zarif look a little bit like idiots at the moment. We, the hardliners, told you you can't trust the Americans, don't sign, and here the Americans broke. Anyway, that's the biggest security challenge, is first of all the nuclear issue, and secondarily the Hezbollah rocket threat, not in that order of immediacy. To get ahead of myself, I believe that if and when the time comes, when every diplomatic option has been exhausted, and I believe in exhausting the diplomatic options, and I was a strong supporter of the JCPOA, not because I thought it was a perfect deal. It wasn't. I think it was misnegotiated. I think the U.S. got out-negotiated by the Iranians. But I think it was the best of the bad options that the U.S. and Israel faced at the time, and I still think that's the case. The president says he wants a new and better deal. I'm all for it. I don't know how you get the Iranians to come back to the table when the U.S. has zero credibility, and now the U.S. wants an even better deal. So I think it also has to be better for the Iranians to get them to do it, and I don't know how you give them a better deal that's acceptable to the U.S., but that's got to be the objective. So I talked about the military threats. I think there are two non-military threats which are as important, at least one of them is. The first is the demographic issue. If you take the combined population of Israel and the West Bank today, just Israel and the West Bank without Gaza, the Jewish-Muslim ratio is 60-40. That's Israeli Arabs, Palestinians in the West Bank. Israeli Arabs are Palestinians. They just happen to remain on the Israeli side of the border after the fighting ended in 49. This combined Palestinian population is 40% of the combined population. That's fine. But if Israel was established to be a Jewish and democratic state, but a primarily Jewish state, is 60-40 a Jewish state? No way, according to my understanding of what it means. Now, the Zionist movement never defined a numerical objective. The idea was, and it was never supposed to be 100%. It was supposed to be a clear majority, an overwhelming majority. Well, without the West Bank, it's 80-20. Has been for a good few decades. And most people in Israel felt, at least on the Jewish side, felt comfortable with that ratio. That's fine. 20% of the population, we have to do everything to ensure Arab rights in Israel as well. But with a Jewish majority, 60-40 isn't a Jewish state. Now, by the way, there's a little bit of good news from the Zionist perspective. The demographic projections that go out to as far as 2060, 2065 now, the 60-40 remains the same, 1 or 2% fluctuation. But that's not a Jewish state. is by no means, by my definition. So that's one issue. And I think the time for a two-state solution is limited. I don't know when the tipping point is. Some people say we've already crossed it. I don't know what that means. I don't know exactly what a tipping point is. It's clear that every day that goes by, it becomes harder because the number of settlers is increasing. Not as much as people think. It's overwhelmingly, Bibi talks one game, but the real game is that the overwhelming number of settlers are actually in the three so-called settlement blocks that even the Palestinians recognize will be part of a territorial swap. But it is slowly increasing, 2,000 or so people a year. 2,000 isn't so much, over 10 years, it's already 20,000 for Israel, that's a lot of people. And land that was available 10 and 20 years ago in Camp David for land swaps has been used and is being used today for other purposes. So it makes it even harder to do the land swap part today. I think we have a window of another few years before, it never becomes irreversible, but before the political will to do it becomes irreversible. Any government, even a left-wing government that's dying to do it, put aside the tens of billions of dollars cost. How do you get this through the Israeli political system? The other non-military threat is delegitimization. I said on the one hand, the good news is that Israel has relations with more countries than it's ever had it before. But its international standing is horrendous. And we lost European public opinion a couple of decades ago, and there are serious inroads now into American public opinion. So losing Europe was a terrible loss for Israel. Losing the United States is existential. And when I say losing, I'm not talking France 1967. That's not going to happen with the United States. But I think that the relationship probably peaked some years ago. I would guess late Clinton, early Bush. But it doesn't matter exactly. And again, this will never happen. But I think we're talking something like this. And if we don't change our policies, it might not be like this, it might be like this. And we were already seeing the American left has turned away from Israel, including a large part of the Jewish community. And it's getting worse day to day, and things like bringing in Otzma Yehudit, the Kahanists into the government is an outrage. It's simply an outrage, and it's just, in terms of the American Jewish community, it's sort of an arrow into everybody's heart. This is a predominantly liberal community. So I would say those are the primary threats. To talk about some of the solutions that or some of the recommendations in the book of the strategy. The number one recommendation, totally unoriginal, people have been talking about this for decades, is either reach a two-state solution if we can, an agreed negotiated solution. And if we can't, then I would give it 3 more years. Now it's 1 year past the next election, American elections. If in that time frame we see that we can't reach the agreement, and I don't think there's any chance of it happening, to be realistic, I don't think we have the necessary governments at the moment in Israel, and we'll see what happens after April 9th, in Ramallah or in Washington. But if we don't see the change in the next 3 years, then I think Israel has to start taking unilateral measures to create a two-state reality. That means that the IDF remains deployed throughout the West Bank, where it feels that it has to be deployed for military, for defensive purposes. But Israel ceases all settlement outside of the settlement blocks and starts encouraging settlers to be coming home. Voluntary inducements, and I'm privy to some internal polling that's been done. The number of settlers who would love to return, including among the hardcores, is remarkably high. You'd be astounded with some of the numbers.
Aren't many of them sort of economic settlers?
Right, but even, yes, you're absolutely right, but even among the so-called ideological settlers, a few tens of percent would love to move back into Israel itself.
A few tens of percent?
Yes. That's the basic idea. I personally think that I would even go a stage beyond that, and I would declare that Israel is staking out a claim, even this is negotiable, for everything west of the fence, that's 10%, but everything east of the fence, Israel announces any claim to. Not announces physical control, military control. But we state this is not part of Israel, we have no claim to it, this is going to be a Palestinian state, and we're keeping 10% for future negotiation. We're keeping it in any event, the military control in the meantime. Let me just say another few words and I'll open it up for discussion. I'm not going to cover all the recommendations or even all the primary ones. I think Israel has to maintain the ability to attack the Iranian nuclear program at all times, because it's, and by the way, I'm a moderate. I don't think that there are some people in Israel who view it as an absolutely existential threat. We've got to prevent this at every cost, because if the Iranians get it, they'll use it. I don't think they'll ever use it against Israel, at least. They're not crazy, they're not suicidal. But the influence that it gives them in future events, imagine if we were facing the threat that we face today in the north, Hezbollah and Iran's attempts to set up air, ground, and naval bases in Syria in the last year. Only they've gone nuclear in the meantime. We wouldn't be able to touch them. They could do whatever they want. And this military presence that they're trying to set up in Syria is to my way of thinking, again, is unacceptable. And we have to prevent that also, even at the risk of war, because another Lebanon in Hezbollah, in Syria, another 130,000 rockets in Syria. And it's not just the rockets, because here they're trying to set up a permanent military base, air, ground, and naval bases. And we can't, okay. So we have to maintain the ability to strike the Iranian nuclear program, even if it means we only gain a year or 2 or 3 at most. But in the meantime, and even if there's a heavy price to be paid. A primary recommendation, though, however, which doesn't quite, maybe won't fit with that, is I think because Israel has become such a secure, established state today, we can start taking a longer-term approach than we did in the past. In the early decades, Israel was fighting for its survival, and it was all about just how do we get to tomorrow. Everything was military. And we probably overdid it even then, but it was essentially correct. Today, because of the change in the nature of warfare, there's no good military solution to any of the primary threats. And because Israel is strong enough, I think we can take an approach today which is based on a few things. First of all, I call it strategic patience. We can address issues over time. We don't have to solve them immediately, and we don't have to respond. We don't anyway. We don't have to respond to any every significant provocation. So we can exercise more restraint, put more emphasis on deterrence, more emphasis on defense, and more emphasis on diplomacy. When I say defense, that's a decision. It's essentially building a national rocket shield. Everybody's heard of Iron Dome. It's an incredible system. Israel doesn't have enough interceptors for the Hezbollah threat, and has not yet made the decision to acquire them. I think Netanyahu at least is heading that way. And I'm not for a 100% hermetic shield. There's no need. It's too expensive to go that far. But a shield which will achieve 2 things that we don't have today. One is at the current level of 10 batteries, Israel still has to make a choice between defending offensive military capabilities such as air bases and civilian infrastructure such as power plants, because if Hezbollah hits some of the power plants, they blacken out the whole country. Between that and protecting the civilian population. So today only part of the civilian population is protected. That choice has to be eliminated. There have to be enough batteries and interceptors to eliminate that choice. And secondly, we have to achieve a level, it's not hermetic, but it's a level of defense similar to what Israel achieved in 2014 during the last big confrontation with Hamas, when unless you lived right around the Gaza perimeter, and in the south, people's lives was disrupted in Ashdod, in Ashkelon, in Beersheba, but pretty much north of Ashdod, people went about their lives completely regularly. I remember the first day or 2, people were running to the shelter. Afterwards, it was a joke. People used to go on the rooftops to look and to watch the show, the incoming and became sort of a sport. If we can achieve that kind of level vis-a-vis Hezbollah, that's what we need. Now that's a that's a $7 to $10 billion decision. The good news is that the U.S. in the 10-year aid package is providing $5 billion for that, $500 million a year for 10 years. So actually, Israel's only missing $2 to $5 billion. It's a lot of money for Israel, but it's a sum that it can come up with. And if we have to impose a new Iron Dome tax, it would probably be the only tax in history that the Israeli people would be relatively happy to pay. So, I mean, here there is a change in mindset, a change in strategy. I'm not saying giving up the offensive capabilities by any means. That's still the heart of the military doctrine, but a greater emphasis, tilting the focus a bit in favor of restraint, defense, deterrence, and diplomacy. And diplomacy is a whole issue, but it's putting the U.S. at the center. It's adopting a position or a policy which positions Israel so that it is perceived by the international community as the side that is always pursuing peace. And in the last couple of decades, the international perception has been quite the opposite. At times correctly and largely incorrectly, that Israel's the side that's the obstacle. We have to change that perception. And part of it is just changing the substance too. And maybe I'll mention just one other primary group of recommendations. It has to do with the relations with the U.S. And I think that short of anything which is existential, there's nothing more important than the relationship with the U.S. because the U.S. is almost existential for Israel. It's the basis for Israel's military might. It's the basis for the fact that Israel isn't and hasn't been the subject of international sanctions for decades. The U.S. provides diplomatic cover for Israel's purported nuclear capabilities. I pose a number of questions in the U.S. chapter. One is, has the price of a remarkable relationship been that Israel's lost a significant degree of its independence and freedom of maneuver? And I argue, and I hope convincingly, that the answer is yes. There are some very smart people, both in the U.S. and Israel, who disagree with me on that one.
Yes, it has lost.
Yes. The second question is, can Israel even survive today without the United States? Now, I don't know the answer, because in desperate circumstances, people come up with desperate measures. There's no doubt that it's an infinitely poorer, infinitely less secure distance. It means going back decades in where Israel stands today. No one in Israel wants to do that, left to right. When I posed that question at meetings in the Israeli National Security Council and the IDF, I expected people to scream and shout, full out of their chest. Everybody sort of nodded, oh yes. Nothing new in that. Well, if you're that dependent that you can even question whether you can live without another country, where is the relationship heading? And if it's not good, and I already said before what I think, then what is Israel, and what should Israel be doing about that? And so I have a number of recommendations in the book, aligning Israeli policy at all times, unless it's existential, if you have to swallow hard. And sometimes there are differences between a global superpower and a local player in terms of their interests. They're not always the same. If Israel has to swallow hard sometimes, then it's got to do that. That's part of the price you pay for having this kind of a relationship. And you never take on the President of the United States and the American Congress, because first of all, he's going to win, and second of all, it's just not done. It's the impact on American public opinion, on Jewish public opinion, was severe. I'm for trying to reach a formal alliance. Frankly, not because I think Israel needs it for military reasons, but as a way of cementing this relationship for the long term, because I think there are demographic trends underway in the United States, unrelated to any Israeli policy, specific Israeli policy. There are long-term demographic trends underway which are going to slowly erode the strength of the relationship. It won't be quite the same relationship. And if we don't do something quickly about the relationship with the Jewish community, it'll be much more rapid and much deeper. So that's why there's that recommendation. Let me stop with that.
A couple of clarifications on the question. I want to make sure I'm understanding the position. You're feeling that Trump withdrawing from the nuclear agreement, you feel is bad for Israel. Okay. And you feel that Netanyahu's appearance before Congress to try to block the agreement was a bad play. Is that
Correct.
okay? And the question I have is, recently Daniel Pipes wrote a piece, and it might be off a little bit, mischaracterizing, but saying that, okay, Trump moved the embassy, and you know, it's a PR, it's not terribly important, according to Pipes, and what that portends, Pipes said, is Trump is going to squeeze Israel and make Israel pay a big price for getting the embassy moved. Do you agree with that?
First of all, I think the embassy move was a good thing done at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. Everybody knows where Israel's capital is, has been for 70 years. Now, having the United States recognize that formally is very important. I think that it's the type of thing that you save for when you're about to achieve a breakthrough and you need something, or the breakthrough has been achieved towards an agreement with the Palestinians, and then both sides are going to have to make really severe concessions. One of the payoffs for Israel would have been the embassy move. It should have been, to my way of thinking, done in that context. Okay, but then you can say correctly, well, we've been waiting for a peace agreement for decades, it's never going to happen. So if you ask me, bottom line, was it a good thing? I would say yes. If Trump is serious about the peace proposal, then he should have waited and held it for that. I think, at the moment, look, there's this great harmony. There's a love fest between Bibi and Trump. I don't think Trump gives a damn about Israel, or anything else, frankly, other than Trump. And as long as Israel serves his electoral purposes, or his personal purposes, then we're best friends, buddy-buddy. And the minute Israel in any way becomes an obstacle to what he wants to do, I think he can throw Israel under the bus without thinking twice. And for those who said Obama was a bad president for Israel, first of all, I don't think he was. I think in many ways he was very good. But I think, in any event, I think the man had a sincere commitment to Israel. He was critical of Israel on the West Bank Palestinian issue. By the way, I'm at least as critical as he was. And I consider myself a pretty good Zionist. I don't think Trump could care less. So yeah, I've been writing, by the way, since the elections, that the Israeli right, the American right, who were elated over this phenomenal change, they may not know what's going to hit them. But we may never reach that, because we're now 2 years plus, and it's certainly not going to be before April, and maybe before the new coalition is formed, so that's May or June. So he's got a year and a half left, but actually he's only got a year before the campaign really gets up going. So maybe we're talking the second administration, if there is an administration. If there is a second administration, then from a right-wing perspective, I'd be really concerned.
Concern. Yeah.
From a right-wing perspective.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I hope it happens. There's other reasons, but
so when I got the email with the title of your book, I had a smile on my face, because Israeli national security and strategy seemed like an oxymoron, and it kind of reminded me of Henry Kissinger's famous sentence to Anwar Sadat that Israel does not have a foreign policy, it has an internal policy, domestic policy. So my question is, why is that historically, and has that changed in any way? Have there been, I don't know, some institutions within Israel that have tried to kind of develop a long-standing national security policy for that sense?
that's a really good question. First of all, not all countries have formal national security strategies. As a matter of fact, most probably don't. And even those that do, and first and foremost the United States, because I don't think there's any other country that has as sophisticated and a complex national security planning system as the U.S. does, which, by the way, doesn't mean that the U.S. doesn't screw up pretty often. It does, but its mistakes are well thought out. But most countries don't actually have a form. Okay. Israel in the early decades, I said before, was all about just to surviving for tomorrow. Nobody was thinking long term. The nature of the threat started changing a few decades ago. Look at the Iranian issue. It's been with us since the early 90s, since 92. And it's going to be with us for many years to come. I'm talking about the nuclear issue. Iran itself, since the revolution. So that's since 79, let's round it off to 80, so that's 37 years. No, excuse me, 40, it's 39, yeah. 39 years. They just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the revolution. And that's going to be with us for decades to come. It's not a matter of what you shoot at tomorrow. How do you position yourself for a long-term threat against an enemy that's adopted a long-term strategy? The Palestinian issue has been with us now for, what, since 1948, but certainly since the Six-Day War, so it's 50 years. Hezbollah has been around, and Hamas since the early 80s. And the threat vector in both cases is pretty similar. They started out with a few rockets, and today a huge number, and it's clear what they're focusing on, which is Israel. So the nature of the threats has changed. It's not that the Arab states get attacked tomorrow. And I think what's happened in the last few decades is that there's a feeling among certainly a large part of the defense establishment that Israel has made too many major errors in recent decades. Now that may be partly coming from a certain political orientation. Actually, the defense establishment tends to be considerably more moderate than the government. Look at all the INSS people I was talking to Scott about before. The INSS is the primary think tank in Israel. They're all center-left. So maybe people on the right feel this a little bit less, but even a lot of them understand that there's a problem, or there are problems. And so actually you see in recent years, there has been a big uptick in the interest. It's not just my book. Uzi Arad he's a former national security advisor, led a group which put out they call it a grand strategy. So they go way beyond the defense and foreign policy issues that I focused on. They're talking about education and technological, scientific capabilities. INSS has put out a number of things that touch on the strategy in recent years, including a short book, but a very good one by Udi Decker and someone else. You remember who Udi wrote about? On Israel's, a proposal for a national security strategy, but it's a partial one. And I think some other people are working on similar projects today. I think it reflects a need for some serious thinking about the challenge.
So my point, should one be thinking about a two-state or a three-state solution? Because Gaza under Hamas just seems a completely separate state.
Correct. I agree with you. I think it is today, for all practical purposes, as a separate state. And unfortunately, I don't see them reuniting anytime soon. All the attempts to do so have failed for over a decade now. Last year was supposed to, it was finally, a few months ago, it was finally a really serious effort. There are fundamental differences here between conflicting ideologies. Hamas is an Islamist theocratic movement. The PA is a fundamentally secular organization. There's two competing parties, like in any country, so who wants to share power, and individual leaders who would have to give up power, and we can see in Israel, for example, how much they love to do that. Right? Okay, so reunification here is really difficult. I don't believe in the three-state, even though you could say, well, it's happening. For the Palestinians, it's unacceptable. Palestinian nationalism is one of the tenets is about unity, because they've known, like it or not, Israel's in the middle geographically, and so their historic fear has been a division into West Bank, Gaza. Their nightmare happened, but everyone on the Palestinian side is committed to the principle of unity to make it happen. is very hard. There can't be a final peace deal until they reunite and Gaza agrees to come back in the fold. Because if you look at Israel's demands, it wants security, it wants peace, it wants all sorts of things. The bottom line demand is what was called back at the time of the Camp David negotiations and subsequently, end of claims, end of conflict. That when we've signed the deal and both sides have made their concessions, but Israel is the one giving up tangibles because we're giving up the territory, that this is it, the conflict's over. End of conflict, end of aims. And if Gaza isn't part of this, then Israel doesn't get its most important objective here. So I think it's got to be two-state.
With 2020 hindsight, do you think Sharon made a mistake in leaving Gaza?
I think the way he did it was a mistake. But to me, getting out of Gaza was just such an imperative in its own right. We're controlling 2 million people who hate our guts. I don't want to control other people. Now, and doing it unilaterally was fine in the sense that he probably couldn't, while Arafat was still alive, there was no chance. But Arafat died in 2004, and the final withdrawal was only a year later, 2005. Why didn't he make a real about-face at the time? Abbas, he's certainly not Arafat, okay? As an individual, he's moderate. Maybe his views on what a final settlement looked like are not that different from Arafat's. But he's against terrorism. Not, by the way, he's never once denounced terrorism on a moral basis. He always says it's bad for the Palestinian cause. But at least he does that. And he can't say, he might even want to personally to say the second half, he just can't politically. He's hinted at a willingness to compromise on right of return. He sounds like he wants a deal. And I think he's missed every opportunity to reach one since becoming president. But at least he talks the game. Why didn't we empower him in 2004? Put him to the test at least. Sharon said at the time his excuse was, if we wait for the Palestinians, it'll never happen. But then you have to wait. Set a timeline, a deadline. 6 months, 12 months. If we can't reach a coordinated, not a deal, an agreed withdrawal, then we do it unilaterally. We could have gotten international guarantees. If you go back in time, 2004, the international community was desperate for Israel to do something. In 2002, Bush comes out with the president's vision for peace in the Mideast. 2003, the roadmap. It gets stuck immediately. This is after, it's 2003, all right, 2004, Camp David was in 2000. The peace process looks like it's dying, it's dead. Do something. If Israel had agreed to withdraw from one settlement in Gaza, the world would have been thrilled. And he was willing to do the whole thing. Why didn't he get some international guarantees and recognition and security arrangements? It doesn't matter if they don't succeed in it. We could have at least gotten something. The international community, the Europeans didn't even recognize the end to Israeli occupation of Gaza. We haven't controlled an inch of it since then. So I think the way he did it was misguided. I think the idea of getting out of Gaza was absolutely right. And, well, I had hoped, it's failed from that point of view, but I had hoped that it was going to be a model for continuing in the West Bank. And actually it's just the opposite, because it convinced a large portion of the Israeli public that even when we withdraw, all we get is terrorism.
That's a question. And on that particular issue, I'd say the Americans also misplayed it a little bit, but I don't want to get too distracted from your book. Look forward to reading it. It looks like sort of majestic and clearly took a lot of effort. On the first part of your presentation, talking about military threats and then about non-military threats, and on the primary non-military threat, the Palestinian issue, you framed it in
demographic issue.
You framed it in demographic terms. I haven't thought about the issue in a long time. About 10 or 12 years ago, I read a great study primarily because I helped edit it, by Shlomo Drom. published by the U.S. Institute of Peace. It was Israeli thinking about the Palestinian issue over a very long stretch of time. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it's a great.
I read it.
Yeah, at the time, I mean, you know him, and he had a great deal of care that went into it. And he showed there were dramatic changes. His study ends in the sort of early 2000s. We have Ehud Olmert, was the first Israeli leader since Rabin, who really campaigned on it. Sharon surprised us. Olmert campaigns on it, and he says that, in my mind, it's the first time it's a mix of politics and strategy. He says, first time in 100 years of Zionism, the clock is against us. He adds a sense of urgency. He has a whole platform for what to do on the Palestinian people, but he goes off to jail, and he doesn't get to work on it. You cite the demographic issue. That's mostly his, I think that was his need to separate seemed to stem from the demographic question. I just want to ask you, I don't want to question whether that's the dominant thinking. I know that's the dominant thinking. Tzipi Livni, maybe, who knows if she's a representative, let's say representative of the professional community. I know that's dominant. Are there second and third tier explanations? For example, is there some sentiment in Israeli thinking, Israeli society that you can identify that is thinking about, well, maybe it's what's restraining us from having better relations with neighboring Arab countries? Is there a normative for human rights? Are there people who are arguing that we have to because it's corrupting our society? I'll quote you if you don't mind. This is one op-ed I love, and I used to have it lost on an old laptop, but from Ze'ev Schiff in Haaretz. He talked about the outposts in the West Bank, said it's a big lie. We've been lying to ourselves, the military's been lying to the government. This is all like a big lie, and the whole enterprise is corrupting us. It was this jarring admission by a guy who kind of represents the establishment. Are there other arguments besides the because the demographic one, this is a comment, not a question, doesn't seem to be, Olmert used it to some effect in that one election in 05, I guess it was, or 06. But it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of traction. Are there other arguments out there?
First of all, and I'll explain, I think it actually gets a lot of traction. But you're absolutely right. That's one major reason. Another major reason is that there is no issue which is harming Israel's international standing that begins to compare with that. As a matter of fact, if you take away the Palestinian issue, big issue, actually, the U.S. and Israel agreed just about everything. Yes, there was the flap. It was a big flap over Bibi's appearance in Congress. It'll take another 5 years. We'll get past that one. And by the way, the one feeds into the other anyway. If you take the Palestinian issue out, Israel doesn't have any fundamental differences with Europe. Yeah, there were tactical differences. Maybe it's a deep tactical difference over how to handle the Iranian nuclear issue. But everybody in Europe is against it. The Russians are against Iran going nuclear. The Chinese are against it. The reason for the horrendous decline in Israel's international standing is the Palestinians. The key to and so I'm talking about my really deep concern about the long-term relationship with the United States. And I consider that to be existential. It's because of this. Now, do some people, I mean, part of the population, of course, is very concerned about the corrupting influence. Most people it's been there for 50 years, it's not changing. In the meantime, people aren't focused on it. We've been hearing about the corruption for decades. It hasn't happened. Well, actually, it is happening all the time. You don't feel it day to day. And it's the Palestinians' fault anyway, because they said no at Camp David, and they said no to the Clinton parameters, and they said no to Olmert. And if they would only finally learn how to say yes once, well, then we'll worry about it. I mean, Arafat, his nose and the Intifada decimated the Israeli peace camp. I don't put all the blame on it. Now, and here's what I said in the beginning, the polls today, after 2 decades of failed peace attempts, show the following. It's currently 50-something% who still support, about 50%, there are different polls, who support two-state. It used to be 2/3. There's a third of the Israeli public that is committed, that wants to keep the whole West Bank, not an inch Used to be 2/3 for two states, it's down to about 50, 50 plus. I think that's just out of despair. And if there was a realistic possibility tomorrow, you'd see it shift very quickly. And the reason I say that is because if 95% of the public is against one state. 95%. Where do you get that kind of majority on any issue in any country? And that is mostly because of the demographic issue. Because otherwise, people say it's the end of a Jewish Zionist Israel. Now, then when you start saying, well, are you willing to withdraw from X? Well, not from there. Are you willing to withdraw from, no. Okay, so Gush Etzion, no. Ma'ale Adumim, no. East Jerusalem, no. But still, the idea that we have to separate is...
So I also wanted to go back to the demographic issue, but from another point of view, and it's kind of connected to my research as well.
What do you focus on?
The evolution of Jewish identity in Israel. So by the year 2048, when Israel celebrates its 100th birthday, about 30% of the population will be ultra-Orthodox, about 20% of the population will be Arab.
In 20...
48, when Israel celebrates 100 years.
It's going to be how much, you're saying?
About 30% ultra-Orthodox, a little bit more, and about 20% Arab. Actually, the Arab percentage is going to decline due to lowering birth rates. But that's 50% of the population that are basically, I don't want to use the word anti-establishment, but non-Zionist, not really assimilated into the state. The state of Israel is probably going to look a lot like West Jerusalem today, which isn't really an example of Israel's qualitative edge over its neighbors, right? So what were your recommendations for Israel's national security with this kind of demographic cohort in Israel's future?
Okay, so the figures that I know give us an extra decade or two. Oh, 2049? Excuse me, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I'm much more concerned about the 30% Haredi, frankly, because the ultra-Orthodox. I don't know how Israel addresses that. Well, first of all, it means changing the current policy, the price supports, the transfer payments to the ultra-Orthodox population. That's something that was done a few years ago under actually a previous Bibi government, or was it only Olmert? I think even the early...
It was an early Bibi when
Early
the
Bibi.
PED was in, and it was a different coalition. They cut some subsidies.
Okay. And the birth rate went way down. Well, went down. If it was sustained over time, I think it would be a significant drop. There is some good news, is that more and more Haredim are going out to work, they're going to study, especially women are going out more, and at least the rest of the world experience indicates that when the level of education rises among women and they go out to work more, birth rates go down. So far that hasn't happened among the Haredim, but if not, then you're absolutely right, and that's economic ruin for Israel, because Israel cannot support 30% of the population that isn't productive, or way below. In terms of the Arab population, you have some of that because employment rates are lower, educational levels are still lower, okay? Among Arab women in Israel, there's a dramatic change in levels of education and levels of work. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the drop in birth rates has been precipitous. It's now the same as non-Orthodox Jewish women in Israel. That happened over a decade or so. Okay. And among the Arab men, it's a slower phenomenon, but it's also, I think actually in the last decade, you see a major change for the better in terms of integration into Israeli society. And I see, I mean, you know this, I'm sure, as well as I do, I see things that I didn't see 10 and 20 years ago with Israeli Arabs at the beaches, and the movie theaters, and restaurants, and everything. And you go to the hospital today, the emergency room, you're at least as likely to be treated by an Arab doctor or nurse as Jewish. So there I think there's good news.
Unless you're Betzalel Smotrich, who refuses.
Yeah, well,
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Had to accept it.
so there's some good news in the reality, and I think the overwhelming percentage of the Arab population wants to assimilate into Israeli society. At the same time that the political rhetoric, maybe like all rhetoric in Israel, and it's true on the Jewish side as well, has gotten much harsher. And I'm not convinced, I don't know enough about the Israeli-Arab politics, but I'm not convinced that the Arab parties really represent Arab public opinion. I think that they're much harder than where most people are. But there is a polarization. There is young people in particular are saying, enough of this, we want something different. Yeah, well, Israel's got two choices. It can either make life in Israel more pleasant for the Arab population, make the Arab population feel better in Israel, or its fear of the Arab population maybe actually becoming a security threat, because until now it's been insignificant. It can make it happen, so it's got to decide how it wants to do.
Can I offer, in the spirit of a small group, a different answer maybe? It's 50%, even if it's not, the 20 or 30% is today, who, on one hand, they are excluded from this agenda, as the Arab segment, largely excluded, and the other, the ultra-Orthodox, they self-exclude themselves, and their focus is on, as you know, narrower social. Even at 50%, maybe it doesn't matter, because they will continue to be excluded. They won't be players on what Chuck's writing about.
They're also, though,
The integration, all that stuff's obviously important.
No,
I'm
they're
saying,
also becoming slowly becoming Israelified, if you will.
Some of the
they're going out to work.
rabbis are realizing that the current model isn't sustainable privately.
Trying to be a little outside.
Okay, but when you say 50%, it sounds like wow, but it's 50% compared to today. Today you're talking about 36%.
Like look downstream of the
Now
military.
that's 36 to 50 in demographic terms is a big difference, and it's over another 30 years. So you're right, it's a very major change, but it's not from 0 to 50, which is what it might sound like.
I'd like to ask about Iran. Do you see it as a genuine existential threat to Israel? And I don't, but what do you think is in the mind of the Iranian leadership as a realistic long-term strategy vis-a-vis Israel? How do you, you've said several times, they're not crazy. They won't just attack and knowing the consequences. So how do you see that? And also on the off chance that there is a Palestinian settlement, they're out there by themselves. How do you see that?
First of all, I think that the Iranian leadership, not the Iranian people, the Iranian leadership is sincerely committed to Israel's destruction. They say it repeatedly. They've poured billions of dollars into it. And one of the things that we learned over the decades, and this wasn't the case in the beginning, is to take the statements of regional leaders seriously. I think we learned the hard way what they say. Yeah, there's a certain nature of Arab politics. It sounds a little bit different, and Iran is not an Arab country. It doesn't matter. For our purposes, their rhetoric is a little different. They mean what they say. And in the Iranian case, it's not talk. It's billions and billions of dollars, and it's a variety of other prices that they've paid, such as international isolation. Now, they know it's not happening tomorrow, and it's not happening in the next decade, but maybe over decades it can happen. That's what I said before, the policy of attrition until destruction. And the nuclear issue is also critical. I don't think they're ever going to use it against Israel. I think that would be national suicide for them. Okay, I don't know what Israel has or doesn't have. It doesn't matter. The entire international community is convinced that Israel is a nuclear power. The Iranians have to take that into account, okay? They're very smart people. Whether Israel has it or not, they have to be convinced the various international assessments range from 70, 80, they were up to a couple of hundred warheads, right? Now, I think they would love to see Israel disappear tomorrow, and if they could do it I think if they could do it at the expense of a few tens of thousands of Iranians, they would do it. But how many? They have got a deep, deep, deep national trauma still today over the Iran-Iraq war, which ended in 1988. They lost 500,000 people over 8 years. Well, if we get into a nuclear exchange, they lose 500,000 people in the first 8 minutes, not 8 years. Do they want to do that? That sounds totally irrational. So I don't think that they want to use it. And that's why I said to you before, I think the primary threat isn't of use, but by the way, I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, that's it, it's national existence. So I think you have to treat it as an existential threat in the most narrow sense of the word existential, even if it probably isn't. The real threat is of the influence that it gives them in every future scenario. I said before, imagine if we were in a situation today, Hezbollah, 130,000 rockets, Iran trying to set up permanent military bases in Syria, and in the meantime they've gone nuclear. We couldn't touch them, because if we did, it would be risking a nuclear war, so we'd let them set up the bases in Syria for lack of choice. As it is, the mutual deterrence today is such that Israel's hesitant, well, it's not hesitant in Syria, but we haven't touched Hezbollah for the last 12 years. And they had 12,000 rockets when the war started in 2006, and they had maybe 3,000 or 4,000 left when it ended. So we've let them build up 125,000 rockets. We wouldn't have let them, that's without a nuclear capability. Imagine if they had it. Which is why I think it may not be existential in a narrow sense. For all practical purposes, it is, and we have to treat it as such. And we have to do everything to make sure it never happens.
For religious reasons, you see it as at bottom, not geopolitical, but a religious conviction. Is that what you think they're basing it on?
Iran is 1,300 kilometers away from Israel. It's about 800 miles. So we have no common border, no common territory to fight about, no common resources to fight about, no common population groups to fight about. None of the elements of a classic interstate rivalry exist. So by a process of elimination, I come to the conclusion that Iran has got a theological problem with a Jewish state in the midst of the Muslim world, or it could have been a Christian state, it doesn't matter. And they can live fine with a Jewish minority in Iran itself. There could be a Jewish minority in Israel. It wouldn't be Israel anymore. They can't live with a predominantly non-Muslim state in the region. I think that's the source of it. And yes, their rivalry has developed over the years, and Israel's allied with the US, which is the real enemy, and there's also various other reasons. But at its heart, yeah, I think they've got a problem with a non-Muslim state.
Yeah, if you're feeling that, okay, so Iran fundamentally is committed to the destruction of Israel. Iran is committed to becoming a nuclear state. They're taking a longer view, but they're committed to becoming a nuclear state. Those two together, do you think Israel has to give some consideration to eliminating the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear state before they become a nuclear state?
Well, that's what I said. Maintaining the ability to strike at any time if necessary. First, exhausting all non-military options. But when the crunch comes,
When it looks like they're on the cusp of becoming nuclear, Israel must do something.
I think so, yes. Because as bad as that will be, we won't achieve more than a couple of 3 years at best in terms of the delay achieved. Because they can reconstitute. They've got the technology today, the know-how. So they have to rebuild some of the facilities. They have to start producing highly enriching uranium again. The estimates today are maybe 2 years. Now, the assumption that we only gain depending on which expert, 1 to 3 years. 1 year means that if the attack is now, then within 60 seconds afterwards, the Iranians have started reconstituting, and it's an all-out breakneck effort, and everything goes well, and nobody tries to sabotage it or cause trouble on the way. I think the 1 year estimates are too low. 2, 3. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? You I don't know if it's in the book, but you cited these polling statistics of settlers who are willing to, quote, come home.
That's not in the book.
Yeah, some of us maybe have heard Ami Ayalon, he for some years was giving a lot of speeches about, quote, bringing them home. I know about some work at Harvard that was done on how do you structure these deals to get as many people to buy in as possible, trying to base it on like other class action settlement examples. It may not be relevant. It's not in the book, and this is a book talk, but that's a fascinating issue you put on the table. Mercedes, what was your trigger for when Israel should start offering? And how would you structure it? How would you bring them home? Because on the surface of it, my first response would be, it's a great idea, but you're crazy. Because the people that control the settlement movement will resist it. They'll resist it violently, they'll resist it politically, and whether it's individuals like the gentleman who killed Rabin or the people who opposed, they were up against Sharon, so they kind of lost. But it feels like they lost that battle, but they won the war, because it is a tough blocking kind of force out there. How do you overcome that, that political class that will try to stop what you just proposed? Anyway, several questions.
No, that's at least on the Palestinian issue, that's the question. At least on the Israeli side. Look, the state of Israel is going to have to make a decision. Does it want to remain a Jewish and democratic state, or is it willing to forgo one of those pillars, or both? And it's going to be a wrenching decision, which was made in the past, but there was electoral change each time. We had a number of governments that were committed to it: Rabin, Peres, Barak, Olmert. It seems like Bibi's been there forever, but it's only 10 years since Olmert. Well, 10 years go by quickly when you're having fun, or less so if you're not having fun. Sooner or later, and it may be sooner, there will be a hardline government. Bibi may lose on April 9th. There's a chance of that happening now. And even if he wins, which is still the likely outcome, the Attorney General maybe tomorrow is supposed to submit his indictment. I think Bibi's days in office are numbered. I think the man's going to be in jail within the next 2 years. And I think he thinks so, which is why he's fighting so hard and doing such outrageous things, such as bringing the Khanis in, because he will do anything to stay at it. He's fighting not just to be re-elected, and he's proven time and again that he wants to be prime minister for a very long time. But now the guy's fighting for his personal life. And, okay. Now, if eventually, either now or half a year from now or a year from now, when the next coalition comes down, this Gantz-led party can be the primary party. It's a party, 3 of the top 4 leaders are former chiefs of staff. It's kind of hard to call them a bunch of left-wing, softy, liberal bleeding hearts, right?
Yeah, he's doing that, but
Not too successfully. And if you notice, he changed tact, because that wasn't sticking, and he came up with this, they're going to form a coalition with the Arab parties, sort of accusing them of lack of loyalty. But he couldn't accuse them of being softies. I mean, Bogi Ya'alon, nobody's ever accused him of being a softie, right? Maybe these guys, I don't think that Gantz alone, and he's going to have a problem with Bogi if it comes to the Palestinian issue, because Bogi is against a 2-state solution because he doesn't believe in it. Not because he doesn't want to separate from Palestinians, but he doesn't believe in a war. But if they can reach a deal that the 3 of them find acceptable, or even just him and Ashkenazi, maybe they've got the gravitas to get it through. And there's going to be some violence, I think a lot less than people anticipate. As I said, there's a surprising number of settlers who actually really want to come back, and the settler movement is going to fight them tooth and nail. Okay.
Even if it's voluntary. The idea you were floating is that it's voluntary.
No, that's for stage one until there's an agreement, because I'm hoping that there'll be a deal. But if it's voluntary, then they'll have a hard time fighting it. They'll fight. I mean, they'll fight it like crazy, but that
Right
I
now,
think.
there's nothing. You want to
What?
move back from Ariel or an isolated settlement, the state of Israel offers you nothing.
But I think Ariel
No, no,
would be
you
in
get
Bush,
additional.
so.
Oh, yeah, no, but you get.
Whatever, I'm just
But
asking.
you get financial.
Any settler who wants to move back today has got nothing, no benefit.
Right.
You only had benefits going in one direction.
Right, and now you can get the financial value of your home and your business, whatever, if you move back.
Under the Freilich plan. Under the Chuck Freilich plan.
No, it's not my plan, it's not my idea. It's absolutely not my original idea. It's been around for years. There was the old Kachol Lavan, because that's what this party is now called also, but there was the blue-white organization which proposed it formally a few years ago. It's been adopted now by an organization that I am active in called the Commanders for Israeli Security. And they've refined the idea further.
But the government does not adopt it.
This government? God forbid.
So, any more or less questions? So let's thank Chuck. I think this was a